Hi everyone, welcome to July's Kids Craft Corner. Today we're going to be learning about the history of quilts and then we're going to make our very own no-sew quilt block. Let's get started. Quilts are decorative blankets and the art of making them has been around for hundreds of years. Today we can buy quilts in the store, but there was a time when you couldn't do that, so you had to make them for yourself. Even though quilts can be decorative, they are not made just to be looked at. Being a blanket, they are a necessity to keep us warm, whether it's by covering up with them or hanging them on the walls, like the pioneers did in their cabins in order to protect against drafts and keep the heat inside. Quilts have 3 layers, just like a sandwich. They have a top, a bottom, and a middle, which is a layer of padding. This example here uses cotton batting for the padding, which is the most common material used for batting. But other materials could be used as well, such as burlap sacks like you see in this blanket. The top layer would be made up of squares called blocks that were sewn together. Eventually, enough quilt blocks would be sewn together to make a quilt big enough to cover a bed. Once the top of the quilt was completed, women would come together and have a quilting bee. A quilting bee is a party where women will work together to stitch all 3 quilt layers together. They would do this by mounting the layers onto a frame that they would then gather around and stitch until the quilt was complete. Sometimes 2 quilts could be finished in one day. Quilting bees were social events, and sometimes at the end of the day after the quilting was done, a dance would be held to help celebrate. There are a lot of different designs to choose from when making a quilt. Quilt designs include the 9-patch, the log cabin, the crazy quilt, the friendship quilt, and goose tracks. The 9-patch quilt design is made up of 9 small squares that are stitched together to make a larger quilt block. It is a simple and quick design to sew because it was a good way to use small scraps of fabric, which made it a popular pattern among pioneers. The 9-patch was also the pattern that young pioneer girls would learn to sew on. The log cabin design is a very well-known and popular quilt design. The pattern is made up of strips of fabric surrounding a small square in the center. The strips of fabric represent the logs used to build a cabin the pioneers lived in, and the square, which is always made with red fabric, represents the hearth, which was the center of the log cabin home. Just like with the 9-patch pattern, scraps of fabric from clothing and household linens were used to make the crazy quilt design, except the scraps of fabric on a crazy quilt were stitched together without being made into a more uniform shape, like a square. It wouldn't even matter if the fabric was different kinds. Pioneers would use whatever they had to make this quilt. This would result in a quilt that was very colorful and unique to the family it belonged to, because it told their story through each scrap of material. During the Victorian era, crazy quilts were made to decorate the parlor, or living room, like this one made in 1896 by Elizabeth Gaines, which was used as a piano cover. The friendship quilt design is made up of quilt blocks, each with a different image on it. Friendship quilts were generally made as a gift for friends who were moving away to keep as a memento. Each woman working on the quilt would stitch a block, and then they'd attach all the blocks together to make one big quilt. The friendship quilt you see here was made by the Help One Another Club from LaRue for member Elsie Bland when she moved to Rogers in the late 1930s. It's not uncommon to find quilt patterns inspired by nature, and a popular nature pattern is goose tracks. To make the goose track pattern, triangle pieces are stitched together to recreate the shape of the tracks geese leave behind, as seen in this quilt made around 1887 for Oscar Benny of Bentonville. It even won a ribbon at the Benton County Fair. Today, most blankets, including quilts, are made by machines in factories, but that doesn't mean that they can never be made by hand anymore. Craft stores still sell all of the needed supplies that you need to make a quilt, including the pattern books, so anyone who wants to make a quilt can. Quilts today can be made with more modern designs rather than the traditional ones, like this quilt that quotes Arkansas poet Maya Angelou, which was donated to the Rogers Historical Museum by the Northwest Arkansas Modern Quilt Guild. You can even make a quilt without having to sew anything. Today, quilts can be made by attaching the blocks and even the third layer of the quilt to each other by tying them together. No thread or needles necessary. The quilts you saw today in this lesson are all part of the collections here at the Rogers Historical Museum. Because quilts are textiles, they are more easily damaged when left under a light source for long periods of time. So in order to help protect the quilts in our collection, we only display them for short periods of time and then store them rolled up in protective papering on tubes, like you see here. We also keep them in a room where the light is not on a majority of the time. Next, our collections manager, Miss Jen, will demonstrate how we roll the quilts onto the tubes.
Okay, so we're going to show you how we roll our quilts here at the museum. I'm going to use just a small quilt square and a small tube and tissue paper to give you an example of how we do it. Since our quilts are very, very big, it would be hard to show you on camera. So what we do is we take a tube and we take some tissue paper and lay it out so that it's about the size of a bit bigger than the quilt. So then we get the tube started with some tissue paper so that we get a nice protective layer of paper between the tube and the quilt square. So then we will take the quilt and line it up on the tissue paper and then slowly roll the tube and paper over the quilt until we get a nice roll. And then when it's all finished and rolled up, we tie off the ends to make the tube airtight.
Now that we've learned about quilts and some of the patterns, let's get to work on our no-sew quilt blocks. Alrighty, so now that we've learned all about our quilts, let's get started on our no-sew quilt blocks. Let's make sure that we have all of our materials. I have my scissors, I have my 2 quilt squares, I have the muslin facing up, and then I also have my top layer right there, and it's actually on the bottom right now. My muslin, I've already gone ahead and measured out all my lines. They are each 2 inches long and 1/2 inch wide. That is what I have found easiest for tying them together. I also have my square of cotton batting. I have my dowel rod, my piece of yarn, my glue bottle, which is already open, and I have laid it down to get the glue ready so I don't have to spend too much time waiting for it to come to the top when I turn it upside down. And then I also have my decorations that we will apply to the quilt block at the very end. So what I'm going to do is, the very first thing, I'm going to go ahead and put my batting square in. It's going to be easier to do it now before we get all of the strips cut. So I'm going to carefully peel this back just to make sure that they are still lined up, my 2 pieces, and I'm just going to set it right there nicely in the middle, and then I'm going to carefully fold that back. Alrighty, so now I'm just gonna pull this towards me a little bit more, and I'm going to start cutting the strips with my scissors. Now you will notice that I already have some parts cut out, all the corners are cut out. I did that because that's going to help the final shape of the quilt block be more of a square once we've got it all tied off. It won't be rounded. All right, so we'll get these cut. And you don't have to worry about cutting your batting that's in the middle. It is far enough away from the strips on all sides that it won't be cut. As you can see, I'm just about done cutting all of my strips on my quilt blocks. Now as you go through, you want to make sure that you're catching both the muslin square and your top layer square. In this case, it's my yellow piece. You want to make sure you're catching both of those in your scissors so you get the fringe on both pieces and they are equal widths and lengths, or else it won't really work. Alright, so I'm going to cut my last two strips here. Alright, so that is done. I'm going to get it a little more centered. So now what we're going to do, we're going to take all of our strips, and you can see it gets a little more difficult once your strips are cut. That's why we went ahead and put the batting in the middle at the very beginning. It was going to be easier to get it in before we cut all the strips. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start tying them. So I'm going to take my muslin strip and my top layer strip, and I'm just going to bring it around and knot it just like this, just like if you were tying your shoes. So I do one knot, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to do it one more time just to make sure that it's nice and secure. Now what you're probably going to have to do as you go along is you might have to sometimes pull some loose strings off your muslin because the strings will come apart. But you might have to kind of stretch it like this as you go along, just so it doesn't get too puffy in the middle, just to straighten things out a little bit, make them nice and flat if you can. Kind of have to do that both times I tie, so again, I'm going to double knot. And we're going to do this all the way around our quilt square. And if you need to, if you find that strips from the previous pieces that you tied together are kind of getting in the way, if you need to, you can kind of tape those down off to the side just so you don't get them stuck up in the part you're trying to tie. 'Cause sometimes that happens to me too. I've gotten a little over halfway around the block. I just kind of want to stop and show you guys what the fringe will look like. So it's going to look something kind of like this. You've got your little pieces kind of going every which way, but you can kind of see how they're starting to go. So I'm on my third row of tying. Now you're going to see as you go through, you're going to have these little pieces come off of your strips of fabric, and that is okay. It's natural for that to happen on fabric. So you don't have to worry about it. Now once you're done, if you want to go through, you can kind of trim it up for the pieces that don't just come off easy. As you see, I'm just pulling some off right now. That one didn't really go come all the way off, but you can go through and you can just trim it up to make it a little more clean looking if you want to. So I'm going to continue tying my strips. Sometimes they slip out of your hands. We are coming to the end here. After I finish this one, I've just got a couple more pieces that I have to tie together. Alrighty, last one. Alright, so now that we've got it all tied, we'll flip it over, and oh my goodness, I have so many little loose strands. We'll just clean those off, and we are ready to decorate. So we provided you with some different materials to help you make your decorations on your quilt square or your quilt block, but you are more than welcome to use things that you can find at home as well to help you tell your story on your quilt block. So I decided that what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a more traditional pattern for my quilt block. It's called a 4-patch. We didn't talk about it in the video, but it's not so different from a 9-patch. You still have squares that make up your design, but instead of 9 patches, you have 4 patches. So they're just some squares. And because it's only 4 pieces, it is going to be just a little bit bigger than it would be if it was a 9-patch. So I'm going to kind of lay it out here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue them down. So I'm actually going to remove these real quick, and I'm going to just focus on gluing my purple squares first. So I'm just going to do a nice line of glue all the way around the edges. And when you glue your fabric, it's going to be tacky. You're going to feel the glue come up through your quilt squares or your fabric a little bit. That will go away as it dries. Get it off my hands there a little bit. So I'll pick up my other one and I'll glue that down. Alright. And you see that it's pulling up some of the edges as I go around. That's going to happen since we tied all the way around, and that's okay. Ooh, got pieces everywhere. So time for my last block for my 4 patch. Alright, pull that up just a little bit. Okay, so you can see that I have my 4 patch, and I want to embellish it just a little bit. Before I do that though, some of my patches had some string, so I'm going to cut those off just to kind of make it a little neater. Since I glued, now I've got some pieces stuck to me. That's okay. All right. So I've decided that I'm going to use some little felt flowers and some buttons, so that will be the middle of the flower. So I'm also going to glue my flower. But since 2 of my patches have flower print, I'm going to put my felt flowers on my purple patches. And don't worry if when you glue these down, if you see the glue coming through, once it dries, you shouldn't see that on your fabric anymore. Okay. Button down for the middle. Alrighty, so now what we are going to do is, in order to hang this up and have it as a decoration, we're going to take our dowel rod and we're going to find some pieces on the side where there's an opening, and we're just going to stick our dowel rod in between the 2 pieces. Maybe, did I not find an opening? I did. There we go. So just, yeah. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to see past all this fringe. Get it in there. There we go. And then you just slide it through until you can find the opening on the side. There we go. So I've looped my dowel rod through. It's pretty even on both sides. So now I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to attach it to both ends. So this way we can hang it on the wall. I'm just going to do a double knot just like I did when we were tying our strips together. And if you want to, you can cut off the excess that you tied, and there you have your very own no-sew quilt block that you can hang up. Thank you for joining me today as we learned about quilts and made our own no-sew quilt block. Stay safe, and we hope you'll join us for next month's Craft Corner. Bye!